Hello, welcome to the Star Eater Astrology Podcast. My name is Athena Reddy and I am an astrologer. If you would like to get a consultation with me, you can check out athenareddy.com/astrology. The link will be in the show notes here and with additional discount information. I have lots of options available. You can either get a face-to-face reading or you can get an MP3 analysis of your chart and current transits in case you don't have time for a face-to-face reading or you would rather have your own personal podcast such as this, and I'll have some discounts on both of those. So be sure to visit athenareddy.com/astrology. Today, we are looking at the astrological forecast for the month of August 2024. And I'm just going to jump right in. The first thing I really wanted to talk about are two planets that are going to be in the same sign all month, and they're continuing from last month, and we're just gonna talk about that first because sometimes it's really nice to look at like what's going to be the same all month, like what is the same vibe, like these aren't moving. And of course that happens with the slower moving planets. We get eras marked by the very slow moving planets. We get eras marked by very slow moving planets having aspects with one another. But sometimes we get these smaller chapters where something's in the same sign for the whole month and it's doing the same thing. I think it's worth thinking about sometimes that the slower moving planets, like the really slow moving planets like Pluto, who takes 20 years to get through, can often just be like, oh, this is the way that it is. Because if you've got 20 years with a planet in one sign, in one house of your chart, you're like, oh, this is just the way that it is. And then you'll find that that chapter actually ends. So I think one of the struggles with viewing astrology and your chart as only about you and only about identity can be that we can often extend looking for our identity or looking for answers to who am I, how do I describe myself, and we're kind of not taking in a transit that we have absorbed into our personality because maybe it's been going on so long or it's been aspecting personal planets for so long. So that's very interesting. It's always worth looking at. What is slow moving that you've taken on as your own or your own perspective of this is just the way that it is. Being able to differentiate between the landscape that's going on around you and yourself is really important. It helps you to stay really dynamic with looking at transits in relation to your chart. So always remember that. You don't have to go out in the weather all of the time, or if you know what the weather is, you can prepare for the weather accordingly with jackets and stuff like that. You might need a parka. Sometimes the weather finds you and rips your roof off, but the weather isn't necessarily your identity. It may confront your identity, but it is not necessarily having directly to do with the identity all of the time. So much of astrological weather is about the outside world, is about the context we're in, is about how the world is actually affecting us. And so many parts of even the natal chart are about the people in your life. They point to people and themes in your life. And your processing of those themes and your taking on of those themes as part of the identity, as part of the self, that part is actually depends on the person, like which part of the chart is gonna be like about you versus, like let's say about a partner, houses that point to partnership. So moving on from that idea, let's talk about how Mars and Jupiter are still in Gemini this month. Jupiter is really good-natured, and whenever it goes through a sign, it's trying to do the most good-natured thing of that sign. And so we're getting Jupiter moving through 14 to 19 degrees of Gemini this month. If you have any planets in Gemini, they're getting this kind of Jupiter juice. Jupiter is very expansive. And again, Jupiter is always trying to do the most good-natured thing. Jupiter in classical astrology can represent law, and the ideals of law are very high ideals that aren't always used properly. It can really be, I call Jupiter the king at the time of peace, right? The king at the time of peace is not at war anymore. The king at the time of peace is ready to expand his kingdom with philosophy, with ideas, with, making sure the farming is going well for everyone, with this sort of idea of expansion and really feeding the people. And how does Jupiter how does Jupiter behave in Gemini? Gemini, an air sign where we have this sort of idea of mirroring and doubling and back and forthing and playing with ideas verbally, very much verbally, that are tossed around. This Gemini house is ruled by Mercury. Mercury, the messenger, Mercury, the communicator, and Mercury's gonna have a little bit of a journey this month. So the house that is like ruling this Mars and Jupiter moving through, the planet that is ruling the Gemini house of your chart will be having some stops and starts this month, because Mercury is retrograding in Virgo. We'll get to that in a minute, but let's just go back to, we have good-natured king at the time of peace, Jupiter in Gemini, really trying to expansively experiment with ideas, really trying to use words in a way that has a good-naturedness to it. But because we also have Mars there in Gemini, Mars is the king at time of war. I always see Mars at the king of time of war, and I do come from, my initial magic background is like Golden Dawn stuff and learning the Kabbalah in relation to the tarot and astrology, though it's not the direction I ended up going in as a practice. I'm a chaos magician who uses astrology. So with Mars, I associate, that's all to say that Mars I associate with Geburah, which is the sphere that represents Mars in the Tree of Life, right? So it's the king at time of war. It's its opposite from the king at time of peace in the glyph that is the Tree of Life, right? And so we have this difference in personality, sort of. The king at time of war has to do king at time of war kind of things. It's defending itself, but it's also maybe doing this sort of idea of conquering. And as I always say, Mars is a knife. Mars does not generate the way Jupiter generates, the way Jupiter wants to grow its garden. Mars's power is where it ends things, is where it cuts things away. And so I always think of this quote from Frank Herbert's Dune, where it's something along the lines of, Arrakis teaches the wisdom of the knife, that you can cut something away and say it ends here. I'm paraphrasing because I haven't memorized that one totally, but it's something along the lines of like, this planet Arrakis is teaching you how to use a knife to kind of carve out your way, to kind of decide what's over. Like, it's really important to be able to sever things that shouldn't grow. And so when Mars and Jupiter are co-present in the same sign, I feel like you often get this energy of growth and taking things away, growth and taking things away. And I use a lot of garden metaphors in astrology. I use a lot of like the sea, ships, and sailors, as well as a lot of gardening metaphors, because I see Jupiter as someone really, really sitting in a very lush garden. So it's like in Gemini, it's like a lush garden of words and ideas and possibilities and everything. And then Mars running around that garden, kind of trying to cut its way through, trying to kind of give that garden a direction, and Jupiter being like, no, there's not supposed to, especially in Gemini, Jupiter being in Gemini is like, no, there's not supposed to be, and there's not supposed to be a direction. It's supposed to be sort of everything growing all at once, why not? And Mars is sort of like, yeah, but, Mars wants to fight with these words. Mars wants to go through these plants to see the plants of Jupiter's garden. I'm just going to go with the metaphor. Mars wants to go through the plants of Jupiter's garden and be like, okay, but which ones of these are pointy, or like which one of these trees can I carve into a weapon, and is like manically looking around what Jupiter is trying to do here. And Mars in Gemini is like, it's the epitome, like on just a really practical level. Mars is about fighting with our words. And so we're seeing that a lot, obviously, in America here with this sort of idea of, we have these two presidential candidates who, it's like, it's words right now. It's throwing words. It's trying to cut direction with words. It's like people are trying to make cuts with words. That is what Mars is. And I think with both Mars and Jupiter in Gemini, if you have any tendency towards anxiety, if you have any tendency towards like mania or like having too much energy, I think mitigating it at this time, mitigating it in this month, and mitigating it whenever Mars moves through Gemini is going to be really helpful. Sometimes we can use a transit or work with a transit, let's say, or see a transit expressing itself in our lives and need to, like I said before, put on the right rain gear for this weather. And so if you know you have problems with like a temper or with going from 0 to 100, Mars in Gemini, it moves really fast. Gemini is a fast moving place. And it's important to really review the ideas. There may be some words that cut like knives. There may be words that slip out of mouths that are very, very sudden. That really want to sever things. And so it's important to think about also Jupiter being there. Like, what have you grown in this area of Gemini experimentation, communication, bouncing off of people, having ideas, like working with words, working with writing and words and this style of communication that's very brainstormy? What have you grown there and what needs to be taken away? And if a lot of times, like, Mars will go through Gemini for people and they will actually sever a friendship or sever a connection. And Gemini, again, is the twins, and it has a relationship. It is associated with the Lover's card of the tarot. And I always interpret the Lover's card as being this card where you are learning who you are by contrast to another. You are sort of like intellectually building identity and building the ideas that matter to you because you have come in contact with a second person, and this sort of idea that another person can be a mirror that defines you or defines the ideas that you are making in your world or defines what's important to you. Sometimes you meet someone you really disagree with and it teaches you who you are, or you are around people who feel really irritating to communicate with. Mars in Gemini, people, irritation from communication. It's a very irritable, manic-y place. So, you know what? Maybe there are some words that need to be said that feel like they're impulsively coming out, but maybe there is a good-natured thing behind it. Maybe you've held back from pruning this garden, let's say. You know, and it depends on what house Gemini is in your chart, obviously, but there's a backdrop of this through the month because we do have Mars and Jupiter moving through Gemini, and so we have both growth in communication and idea making and this sort of thing, as well as this desire to, in a lot of ways, cut away the parts that are really irritating. I always see Mars as an irritant. It's like, oh, the irritant is there and it can't be ignored. It wants to, it wants to cut forward. It's like an energy that's really hard to handle unless it's really expressed. And so if you're somebody who speaks before you think, and that has gone poorly for you in the past, this is a time to put on that weather where maybe you hold your tongue or you get those ideas out through writing. I think Gemini very badly wants to speak to the other, but Gemini is also a place where we can experiment through writing, and it's always important to remember that you can write anything you want. You can, you can write some of your darkest, nastiest passing thoughts and just like really be able to see what kind of asshole you are. I think Mars and Gemini, it's important to know which asshole you are, because everyone's got an asshole side. Everyone has a potential to be aggressive. Everyone has a different kind of aggression, and it's not worth looking at yourself as only the benevolent version, as only half of yourself, as only, Jupiter trying to be the king in time of expansion and like wanting to be your most generous self. That's always available to you. But some of the hardest things are to look at, like, who am I when I'm fighting, and where am I kind of going wrong when I'm fighting? Because like being able to voice dissent in a community, in a relationship, in a partnership. Gemini is very much about a certain kind of partnership where there can be brainstorming. I have my 10th house. My 10th house is Gemini, and the last time Mars was in Gemini and conjunct my MC at the top of the chart, there was actually like kind of a verbal disagreement that turned a little bit edgy, and it led to the severing of somebody who was in partnership with me on a professional level. We were writing together, specifically Gemini. We were writing something together, and there was just a disagreement about specifically with communication styles that couldn't be resolved, right? So it was quite a nasty severing, and I think there were regrets on how it was expressed. Like, Mars in Gemini is very much, I let my words get away with me, and it wouldn't have been that harsh if I wasn't moving so fast. And I think the person on that I went through this with probably feels the same way, where it was like stuff got ahead of itself and there was like a manic quality to it, but it also needed to happen. So it's like, don't avoid the fight. You know, whenever Mars is whenever Mars is Marsing and it's affecting your chart, don't avoid the fight totally, but go in with your weather gear and do your best not to cut too hard, you know, not to cut too hard with words. But if stuff has been festering in the garden, because I mean, the dark side of Jupiter, when I talk about this garden thing, is like growing so much in the garden that you can't leave the garden because you have everything you need. And there's this sense of like comfort and abundance and wanting to share things with people. But you do sometimes need to prune things. You don't want overgrowth and like to lead to weeds and like trying to include everyone and everything and grow in every way possible. And I think Jupiter in Gemini specifically, it wants to grow ideas, and you can't have an endless amount of ideas without cutting some away. I very much see Gemini as this brainstorming planet. Gemini and Virgo, we got a lot of stuff happening in Virgo this month, but which I will get to, but Gemini and Virgo are both ruled by Mercury, right? And Mercury really wants to communicate, and when it communicates in Gemini, the air sign side of Mercury, it does have in Gemini something that's about ideas. It has this sense of possibilities, but it can sometimes have too many ideas at once and kind of spin and kind of find direction. I had a client recently with their Mars chart ruler in Gemini, and they also had a Sun Mercury Cazimi in Gemini. And you know, Gemini folks have come to me over the years and just been like, I need to find direction. I need to narrow down this thing. And a lot of times the advice that I have is for the Gemini side of Mercury is just like, no, your brainstorming powers are really, really important for whatever teams and people you're part of. You know, just allow yourself to be in partnership with somebody who can help you pare down those ideas. I think we think of wanting to perfect ourselves or find things through our natal chart to grow out of, when really it's a strength. And with Gemini, it is like finding that partnership that can be grounding, or finding those activities that are outside of ourselves that can be grounding and provide that direction, right? Whereas the Virgo expression of that Mercury energy, Virgo being Mercury's other sign, will you know, listen to all those ideas and be like, okay, now we're going to make them happen, and here's how we're going to make them happen, and I've listened to all the details and I would like to do something about it. So a lot of times I think like a Virgo Gemini argument or something, let's say, or a Virgo Gemini kind of disagreement of Mercury's, and this kind of energy that we're having coming up this month as Mercury is in Virgo, and as we have the Mars Jupiter in Gemini, we get this sense, right? We get this sense that what's the difference between spinning around with a lot of possibilities of ideas and what's the first step? Like, Virgo's just not afraid to do like the boring first step of things and like the foundational work of things. So this month it might be a really good time to kind of narrow down, like really narrow down what you're doing, and see like what are the steps to actually do it. Okay, so that's just what I wanted to talk about. And this the Mercury will go retrograde this month, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, because I feel like that's one of the things that's like becoming colloquially common. Like, I've watched over the, you know, decade plus of being an astrologer and being an astrology student, I've watched things go from people knowing their sun signs to people understanding, oh, I have sun, moon, rising, to people in more of the common parlance. As you talk to people who know a little bit about astrology, then Saturn return became the next thing that I felt like more people were familiar with in my sphere, like even non-astrologers, even people who were interested in it casually. And then the next thing that became included in like the more common parlance of amateur astrologers or people who passionately follow astrology was that people, oh, they're like Mercury retrograde. And a lot of times now, a lot of people know the common parlance of Mercury retrograde. And I think with this Mars in Gemini, it's important to cut away some of the things that have become like rote in the way we describe things. Astrology is an art of finding language to match these symbols. And I think sometimes when that language becomes mimetic, when we're just repeating off of each other, we kind of lose a lot of details. It's really nice that people understand wider concepts of astrology, because in a lot of ways it validates astrology and makes it more popular, which is really wonderful that more people are using this tool, right? But also it's actually important to, and this is Virgo rising thing of me, and I feel the Virgo-ness coming in, but it's important to be really precise and to allow some of this stuff to evolve. And one of the Gemini issues is sometimes of things becoming mimetic. Like we spread memes of words, we mirror each other. But this sort of idea I was talking about before of the other being a thing that contrasts against the self, of teaching us who we are against another, it's actually really important to find a myriad of words that give a lot of nuance to things, because the memes we create word-wise and otherwise and spread amongst each other are just us mirroring each other's minds, and that's really great for community building, and that's really great for connection, but it's not the whole of the thing, right? And that's why it's good to have an astrologer around. Actually, I do want to just, before I move on, I'm kind of like going through this month in a vibes way. I'm gonna get to specific dates in a second that you can write down or follow along with, but one of the dates I wanted to just throw out there was that Mars is going to be conjunct Jupiter in Gemini around the 13th. And so that's a point where with Mars conjunct Jupiter, a lot of these concepts of wanting to be good-natured but having to fight with words, wanting to be as good-natured and expansive as possible with words, and wanting to fight. A lot of times Jupiter will soften that Mars. Jupiter can really soften that Mars in a lot of ways. So that actually could be the day where a fight happens verbally with a little bit more, let's say, diplomacy to it, or with a little bit more goodwill towards it. And that Jupiter conjunct Mars in Gemini that's happening then is going to be part of this big T-square we're seeing in the middle of the month, and is going to be, that's why I really wanted to talk about the backdrop of these two planets being there, because it's really at the center of this difficult and tense square that happens a little like in the middle of the month. The beginning of the month this month is a little bit more of the same. We're kind of limping around. I think a lot of people are feeling the shadow period of the Mercury retrograde, which is the degrees that it will go through as it goes forward and as it goes back. And a lot of times that comes with dealing with annoying details or dealing with things we thought were finished and everything. So we have a little bit of that that's trickling through this month. It's a lot of details to take care of. It's just, if you didn't dot your I's and cross your T's, you're going to be dotting those I's and crossing those T's double, this month. And so we're looking at when Mars and Jupiter, which I've been going on about for this in Gemini, actually come together in the exact conjunction where these ideas can express their absolute best or their absolute worst. So all that stuff I said about the king at the time of war and the king at the time of peace, this is how do they come together to be this balanced thing, which is neither gluttonous nor too nasty. And that can be super interesting. But that is really important to understand as I go on with this month. Okay, let's just take a look at some dates. So if you're following along and writing along to this, let's just take a look at some dates. This is a long episode. This is a long forecast. I hope I'm being entertaining enough. I never make cuts to my podcast because I want it to feel like we're hanging out, and I'm not interested in perfection. I'm not interested in perfectionism. I'm a recovering perfectionist, and this is how I talk to my clients. There are mistakes, there are bouncing back and forths, there are explorations of ideas, and it's not linear. But this next part's going to be linear for anyone who wants to write it down in order. I'm a recovering perfectionist. If you're a perfectionist who wants to control everything, I think my podcast might be good for you because I'm letting go. I'm unleashing. Anyway, so we have, obviously, Mars and Jupiter moving through Gemini for the rest of the month. Mars is moving through 7 to 27 degrees of Gemini, and Jupiter is moving through 14 to 19 degrees of Gemini. So if you have anything in Gemini or the other mutable signs, Pisces, Sagittarius, and Virgo, if you have stuff in there, that's going to be affecting you. All the stuff that I was saying before, that's going to be affecting you more. Look to your Gemini house to see how all of that expresses. Okay, then we have a new moon in Leo on August 4th, and that's going to bring up these new moon in Leo feelings. So a new moon, is this time to start again, or is this time to go inside and be reflective about things? And it's interesting because Leo is ruled by the sun, but this is a new moon, a dark moon in Leo on August 4th. And so the new moon in Leo, with that Mars conjunct Jupiter at the same time, it's like we want to be really expressive, and it's weird. Like whenever there are sun moon things, like Leo is ruled by the sun, but this is a new moon, we have this thing of like, what is external? What are we shining outward versus how do we reflect on that inwardly? And so with the sun, a sun ruled sign, the new moon being in there, I think we're really looking inside to see how we have expressed ourselves, Leo, how we've expressed ourselves over the past Leo season, and how we kind of like want to express ourselves going forward. Just kind of going in and reflecting upon like what were we sharing of ourselves throughout the past couple weeks, and how do we want to share of ourselves going forward? Like which parts are we going to show? I think new moon in Leo is always kind of gets introspective about what we're externally radiant about. It's like a real pause in a way, and the Leo energy is saying like, was I sharing too much of myself? A lot of times when you're insecure, you can be like, was I taking up too much room? Am I taking up too much room? Do I have to prune things away? And that can often come from insecurity. Or maybe you're reflecting internally, being like, I really showed pieces of myself. I really showed parts of me. And guess what? It was accepted. And it turns out that I'm allowed to be louder or bigger or radiate more into the space. So the new moon in Leo on August 4th is a really nice time to go ahead and just be like, yo, it is okay for me to be self-expressive. It is okay for me to radiate out my vibes, like radiate out my ideas and take up room. And I think what Leo knows that's very, very wise, because a lot of times on a new moon, we're going inward and we're getting dark and we're getting the wisest. To me, a new moon is about the wisest part of the sign, right? It's about, because a new moon means the sun and moon are conjunct one another. So we're getting to understand how we express outward and also how we process that inwardly. And there's no better new moon for that concept than a new moon in Leo, right? We just have this this ability to see what's behind the way we self-express, right? And also to make some adjustments. Like maybe you do want to take things away. I think it's also important with the new moon to just note that like some people's energy drains and goes low, your energy drains and goes low, and you'll be able to self-express again soon. And it's okay that you're just, I'm an actor and I went to conservatory, and when you're going to learn something like that, a self-expressive art, when you're going to do it for like 8-10 hours a day, there are some days, when you don't get a lot of breaks, there are some days where you're going to be able to show up with big energy and understand how you're giving to the space and really shine out. And there are other days where you're not going to have energy, but it doesn't mean you're not working on the thing that's about that leonine expression, that's about that radiating outwards. Is just that you're doing some of the work with a little bit lower energy. And so I feel like a lot of people who have had the Leo planets kind of expressing really lovely in their charts, or people with sun in Leo, or people with other planets in Leo risings, may have had like a lot of outward warm self-expression, and sometimes it's addictive and it's lovely and it's nourishing, and it's this thing that you get to share with other people, and you're shining outward. And then as the new moon gets there and it wanes, you kind of are like, oh no, it feels a little darker. It's okay. Just reflect on it. It's okay. You can still show up and be yourself with lower energy. I think there's a sort of lesson I learned from a very good friend of mine where I I can go through really low energy and some deep depressions. And what I've learned from being in the relationship I'm in is that you can still hang out with people and your energy can still be appreciated even when you're not at 100% cheery, glamorous perfection of fun. And I think that's really important to learn. I think that's a really important thing to learn. I think key words between Gemini and Leo, two signs where we have a lot happening this month, a key word that they share is fun. And so what do you do when a malefic like Mars is moving through one of the fun signs like Gemini, like one that is actually fun seeking, or one of we're a new moon or a darker thing, or we're having the Mercury retrograde dip back into Leo this month. What are these fun signs, these fun-seeking things that want to share with the world in this fun and radiating and conversational way? They're both very social and sharing signs, right? So it's like, what happens when you don't have 100%? Because I think Leo wants to shine out with 100%, all heart, be warm, be that fire that people gather around in this way that's very given. And what happens when the fire goes a little lower, do people still appreciate it? Yes. And just kind of circling back to what I was saying is like, what I've learned about being this relationship I'm in is like, when there is a deeper, darker depression or something like that, being able to say, I'm not feeling well, will you hang out with me anyway? And I just need to like sit down and we do something quiet. People can appreciate your energy even when you're not at 100%. And I think one of the most important things to know about depressions is that they get really bad when you get really lonely or when you narrow your field of vision. There, in a lot of the movement practices I teach being able to open up to the periphery, open up to the world around you, because a lot of times when we're depressed, we get literally narrow, like our vision narrows, we go within in a way that folds in on itself. And I think there's an assumption often that we don't want to be around people, or that if we are around people and we're dragging ourselves out around people and they're having a good time, it can be grating, right, if you're really low. But can you share your imperfect self-expression with people, even the side of you that's going to be low energy? Can you sit there with somebody and find the little moments? I feel like even like I've had anhedonia, unfeeling depressions, and how do you find fluidity in that kind of thing, right? How do you find fluidity how do you find your way out of there when you're feeling literally narrow? And I think what I've found by seeking out friendship and partnership and honesty in times where I'm a little lower is this sense of gallows humor, is this sense of sort of being like, I'm not okay, I'm not okay, and like being able to just kind of like repeat that and even laugh about it. And I think Leo kind of has a hard time doing that because it wants to be the biggest, warmest expression of fun that is generous, and with that Jupiter in Gemini, there is this will to express and go through words. But as your energy waxes and wanes, like your physical energy, as it waxes and wanes, it's really important. And I think what some of this stuff in Gemini can teach us too is flexibility. Like we have Gemini and Virgo stuff this month, and these are mutable signs, and this is about flexibility. How do you do flexibility? How do you accept yourself on days where your self-expression is imperfect, on days where you're not being like some kind of peak version of yourself? How much of you is really able to show up? And any amount of that at all is really good. If you want to, any amount of that at all is really good. You don't have to be at full brightness. And I think the new moon in Leo can often really teach us that. And at that time too, right around that new moon, Venus is in her last degrees of Leo. So there is like also this desire to do Venus things that are Leo-y still. I think when a planet gets to its last degrees of a sign, the anaretic degree, the last degree, it often is punctuation. It often is the final, like, this is what this means in your chart, in your sign. And so around that new moon, we're getting that Venus in the last degrees of Leo. So there is this sense of, because Venus is about pleasure. It's also a very garden growing planet. It's really about this sort of pleasure and pleasure seeking and what brings us pleasure and wanting like social lubricants and all of this stuff. And so Venus in Leo does really want to go out there and self-express and find pleasure from that. And we've had that Venus in Leo going on for all last month, and we've gotten kind of used to maybe that style of sharing or that style of glamour and everything. And Venus is going to enter Virgo this month on the 6th. So that's 2 days after that new moon in Leo. So we get Venus entering Virgo on August 6th again. And Venus has trouble Venusing in Virgo, right? Because Virgo can be very discerning. Virgo exists in this way that is discerning. We say that Venus is in detriment in Virgo because Venus doesn't Venus that well in Virgo, but she still has really lovely and important things to do there. A lot of times when you're very detail oriented or even picky, or you're noticing details, or if you have lots of Virgo stuff, a lot of times the way you give love is being able to point to all of the cracks and imperfections of something, and that can come from a place of love, but it can feel like it's really picky. It can feel almost confrontational to people, but a lot of times Venus expresses through Virgo by lovingly pointing things out that kind of need to be fixed, or pointing out details that might be kind of annoying. Like it's becoming discerning, because Venus just wants to share and love and find the pleasure. And with Virgo kind of being like, oh yeah, but there are some things I don't like. I want to refine the pleasure a little bit. And Venus is just kind of like, no, like pure Venus just wants to be able to share the pleasure and expand the pleasure and nourish and feed and that kind of thing. But in Virgo, Venus is kind of like, it expresses its love, its ability to connect by kind of pointing to some of the things that aren't working, because that's actually really important, otherwise kind of Venus could get drunk on pleasure, right? And so this kind of little season that we have of Venus going through Virgo has this sense of being like, well, the thing that I was having the most fun with isn't as much fun right now. There are actually flaws in it. But to be able to enjoy something further is to be able to go there, to be able to be honest. I mean, I think Virgo's very honest. It's honest about flaws. It's honest about the things that are going wrong. It's very honest about separating the wheat from the chaff, right? Like Virgo is a time for this kind of harvesting, right? Like it has this autumnal energy of being like, I'm moving between seasons. I'm fucking Virgo, man. Like it's a time between things where I have to be very flexible in transition, and being able to be flexible is being able to separate the wheat from the chaff, even in the realms of pleasure, where you don't want to go in there and be like, oh, this part of the thing is not bringing me pleasure anymore, or like there's overgrowth in this place. And in that way, it has the same energetic quality in a gentler way to what I was talking about with Jupiter having this growth, right? And Mars needing to cut it away. But Virgo is picky. And a Venus in Virgo season is sort of like, it's not as fun. It's not as expansive pleasure. But there can be pleasure found in the act of maintaining something. There can be pleasure in the actual act of, I hate to say it, but there can be pleasure in the act of washing the dishes, lining up the papers, taking care of all the details of what can really bring us pleasure, like reviewing the recipes we want to cook and like taking the ones out that our partner didn't like, and being like, that sort of thing. Okay, so because Venus enters Virgo on August 6th, so we're getting that coming in. And Mercury has been in Virgo, and Mercury's really well in Virgo. Mercury loves to take care of details, give messages. It's about like the mind and thinking in a really practical way. It can be a lot about admin work. If you're a writer with Mercury in Virgo, you may have been able to be very prolific depending on how it's affecting your chart. It can also be like this idea of being a very structural style Mercury while also being very flexible. So like, for example, my spouse is a screenwriting master's student who has a lot of like structural stuff that he learns, and a lot of there are some people who stick really hard to structure, but the key is to learn the structure and be able to move within it. That sort of idea of moving within a structure because you understand how the structure works is what Virgo does really well. So we've had Mercury in Virgo for a little while now, but it's stationing retrograde on August 6th. And retrograde, as many of you know, is when a planet appears to go backwards through a sign. And in astrology, we're saying there's a lot of review, there's a lot of reevaluation, there's a lot of repeating that's going to happen. So Mercury stations retrograde in Virgo on August 6th. And so we're going to be reviewing the past few weeks. There may be, like I said before, if you didn't cross your T's and dot your I's, there may be a lot of annoying T crossing and I dotting. And a really good example of this is that I have Virgo rising, and I've really, really felt the shadow period of this Mercury retrograde, which means it's going through the degrees that it's going to go backwards through. And so I've talked to a couple of clients who have felt that the shadow period, and I think I said this before, the shadow period has actually been really, really annoying, and they're not looking forward to the retrograde, because if it gets more annoying than it's been about doing all these annoying admin tasks or having miscommunications and having travel issues or whatever it is, if it gets more annoying, can I handle it? But I think all the people who have jumped in and like, I have Virgo rising, and we had a really hard issue with my health insurance, and one day I was on the phone for like 3 or 4 hours, like on hold, and being like bounced around to places, and it was just the most bureaucratic, administrative like roller coaster ever. And I also had to go to the DMV the same day to update my license, and I had to take a test. Because I moved to a different state, so I had to take a test to re-up my license, and I had failed it twice at home via the internet, so I had to go do it in person. And this feels like all this Venus and Virgo stuff, and it's in my first house, so it was really loud, it was really present. If you have your Virgo house on one of the angles, which is the first house, the 7th house, the 10th house, or the 4th house, you might have these themes being really loud. Or of course, if you have stuff in the mutable signs, which is Virgo, Gemini, Pisces, Sagittarius, this particular Mercury retrograde and this particular Mercury transit will be affecting you a little more, or it will be louder for you, or you'll see it happening in your world a little more. So it can be very literal in that way. Some transits are really, really literal when you've got planets in the sign with the same modality out, or you've got those signs on the angle. But yeah, Mercury stations retrograde on the August 6th, and so, you know, if you dotted your I's and crossed your T's, you might be okay. Like, you might see the benefits of doing that. Like, we sorted out my health insurance, and I have an appointment for the doctor I need to see that happens in this time period. So if you've done that stuff, it's probably going to be okay. You're going to probably be revisiting those degrees of Mercury and Virgo in a way where you're the reviewing that happens in the retrograde, that reviewing all the R's, revisiting, reviewing, revising. It's gonna probably be a revisit to the stuff that you set up that was annoying to set up. So this Mercury retrograde is weird like that. And it also, Mercury goes all the way back into Leo, where we're even further reviewing some of the Leo Mercury degrees. And so Mercury re-enters Leo backwards on August 16th. So that's a day where there's a vibe shift, and it might even be like, oh my gosh, I really thought I sorted this out last month, but this is not around as many things of bureaucracy and irritating details as it is about, again, this Leo Leo stuff, this self-expression stuff, this like shining out kind of stuff. So with Mercury, the communicator, going backwards into Leo, we might have conversations that are coming up that are kind of around the self, that are kind of around the way that we've shared. And it could be great stuff. It could be like, it has the energy of like, you were in a play and somebody sends you an email a few weeks later saying like, oh, you were really great in this, I was in the audience. Like it has that vibe to it. But it also has, again, like I was saying with the new moon in Leo, if we feel small, if we're people who don't have a lot of Leo in our charts, or, the Leo house is not well aspected or something, and we're afraid of taking up space, we're afraid of Mercury saying things that express ourselves, our own opinions, that have this individual quality to them. If we're afraid of doing that and taking up that space, and we're kind of more doormats to people, I think Mercury in Leo really encourages us to learn how to say what we actually are thinking, because that's not selfish. That's a way of being part of the tapestry of community, honestly. Like Leo has this reputation for being like, oh, me. But Leo really teaches us in a lot of ways how to just be very honest about what we actually think, how to actually take up space. And taking up space is important because we need to see each other. Leo's ruled by the sun. We need to see each other. We need to hear each other with Mercury. Mercury and Leo, we really need to speak loud enough for people to hear us. And so if there were things that went unsaid that were shining inside of you, that you held your tongue at when maybe last month when Mercury was previously in Leo, now could be a time to actually say it out loud, to actually like put your voice proudly into the arena of the community, because a community is not a community without a group of individuals, right? It's not. And so that's important, right? That's important. So on August 16th, you might be reviewing those sorts of things. And kind of on the flip side of that, if you've taken up space in a way that's taken things away from others, there might be a time here of reviewing, reflecting, and, if you have stepped on some toes with some of your words, even if they were coming from a good-natured place, that might come up again. That might come up again a little, but don't worry. Mercury is going back through Leo. It's going back through Leo, and so you get to kind of revisit that stuff. And again, there's this big reflection of Leo things here. This big reflection of being able to go like, almost like, who am I and how is my light useful for this community? How do I spread myself out in a way that is sort of unapologetic and which people are gonna feel like their toes are stepped on, kind of thing. But Mercury stations direct. It starts going forward again. It's gonna go forward again in Leo on August 29th. So a lot of these revisitings, reviewings, and everything, you're gonna feel them end on August 29th, but then that Mercury has to go forward through those degrees. It will revisit those degrees of Leo that we've reflected on and go back into Virgo next month. So, there you go. There's a lot of reviewing of that stuff. And there's this feeling with August 29th, by the end of the month, there is this vibe shift where you're able to kind of move forward. You're like, I've reflected upon the things I've said and done and how I've shined out and all of this stuff. And I am ready to get this over with and move forward and prance through the rest of Mercury in Leo. And next month, I'm going to do the action. I'm going to do the details of my words when Mercury goes into Virgo for next month. So that's nice. And some of this stuff I'm saying about Leo and self-expression and being able to be an individual so that you know which community that you fit into, where your voice is important, right? Where your voice is important. I always view opposite signs as two sides of the same coin. Like they're not opposites in the way that like we're complete opposites. They're opposites in a way where they're in conversation with one another, where they're reflecting ideas in conversation with one another. So we have a full moon in Aquarius, the opposite sign of Leo. That's usually how full moons work. The moon is in opposition to the sun. We have the full moon in Aquarius on August 19th. And that full moon has a lot of other stuff happening around it. That full moon chart is big. And like I said, the new moon is like going within. The full moon is like, it's a release. It's letting out. And Aquarius, the other side of the coin of Leo, that self-expressive need to show yourself, in the world so that people know which guy you are. They need to know which guy you are so that you know which people to be around. Leo is very honest in that way, honest about shining out. Aquarius is the opposite of that. Aquarius is a sign that it is about the group and community at large. It's very humanitarian focused. Aquarius kind of sees things more from above and sees how the pieces are moving, how the individuals are moving within the circle, within the community. And so a full moon in Aquarius is a chance to think about some of the things that we've thought about with self-expression and be like, where am I gonna culminate this in the community I'm in? How do I fit into the world that's around me? What's the texture of the ideals of the groups and communities that are around me? But here we go, because the middle of August, the 10th through the 20th, there is this nasty T-square, and August 19th of this full moon in Aquarius kind of hits near the end of that T-square being exact. So let me explain what a T-square is. A T-square is when at least 3 planets are making squares to each other, and if you look at it on a chart, it makes this triangle. And in most programs that you would draw up a chart in, it would be a red triangle, and when things are red, it's a more difficult aspect, right? It's more difficult set of aspects. And so with that full moon in Aquarius on August 19th, we're seeing the culmination of some of these crazy tensions that have happened between the 10th and the 20th with this tense T-square. So what planets are in the T-square? In the T-square, we have Saturn, the structurer, the time daddy, the squeezer. Saturn, which is in Pisces, is making an opposition to Venus in this T-square. And again, it's Venus in Virgo. It's Venus. She's not in a great position. She's being picky. She's being discerning. And she's trying to seek pleasure in a way where you have this Saturn opposition to Venus, where it's really this energy of holding back pleasure or trying to make structure around pleasure. And on a mundane level, I mean conversations about bodily autonomy, because Venus is so much about being able to enjoy pleasure in the body. We see a lot going on with people talking about reproductive rights, of talking about bodily autonomy in the government, and Saturn, which is the structurer, can often be one side of the government, right? Can be one side of we're trying to make rules about this. We're trying to codify something into law. And Venus really does have that quality of maybe being about a woman's body. And so this is a time where we're facing that kind of thing. And it's really important to be able to understand some of the squeezings and codifyings that are going into that in law, depending on where you live. Venus as part of this T-square, and she's in Virgo, and she's kind of having a rough time because she's trying to care for all of these little details while things from the outside are trying to kind of structure her up. It's like this feeling of not being able to move within yourself. I always use that phrase, move within yourself, because there are a lot of structures, the body can often be in pain, but you can still move within yourself in your mind, or your government may have a lot of restrictions on you, but there's still somewhere within you that you can move within yourself, that you don't have to completely be shut down and squeezed. Where can you move within yourself is a really good question here. And so both that Venus and Saturn are making squares to that Jupiter in conjunction with Mars. So all of that stuff I was saying about that Gemini, Jupiter, Mars, where there is this desire to move forward with a good nature, but it also is a bit manic. These are all in play with one another in this tense T-square. And it's rough. And I have a couple more notes about it because I have to look at them. I have to look at my notes. Where are they? See, this is what's great about not being a perfectionist. You get to know me. You get to know me being where's my thing? That's not the right piece of paper. Gotta love it. Oh, it's right behind it. Okay. So with the T-square too, it's we have, so part of the T-square is that Jupiter, that expansive king at the time of peace, making a square to Saturn. these two planets really represent government. Jupiter in the way that, again, I said king at time of peace. He's trying to make laws that are really, really fair, that are really, really good natured. Square Saturn, which wants to kind of squeeze structure, build boundaries, build walls and that kind of thing. So there's this idea of regulation of how we grow. Jupiter wants to expand and progress, and we definitely have that here in America. You have this feeling of people desiring growth, progression in a direction, and you have the Saturn coming in with other people really trying to cut that back, and that square is going to be you're going to see that tension in the world, and you can see that tension individually, especially if you have stuff in mutable signs in your chart, because this square is in mutable signs. And I think what's so frustrating about it being in mutable signs is that mutable sign people really do want to be flexible, really do want to move within themselves and the world, and be able to find ways around where they don't want to be structured, they don't want to be tense. And that Saturn, that squeezer, that boundary builder is in Pisces right now. And like it's weird in Pisces, because Pisces is also about like melting and all is one and interconnectedness, because we've had Saturn there for a while, it's like there's this feeling of wanting to govern and restrict that. And Saturn's been really trying to do that, but I mean, people are leaking through. Like Saturn's not totally winning its Saturn missions here. It wants to regulate Pisces style things, which by their very nature are going to leak out. And so there really is this sense of Saturn not actually being able to Saturn that well in Pisces. So there's room to move within yourself. There's room to leak out. Just be very careful, because Venus is going to be picky, and like, it's not going to be perfect pleasure. It's not going to be perfect pleasure. It's not going to be perfect lubricated social light communications between people and things. But you still can leak out with your commonalities, like I feel like Venus in Virgo really reminds me of infighting. Like, they talk about the Democrats infighting, or they talk about different groups who are infighting and becoming too picky or becoming too discerning with their words. But in a lot of ways, looking toward, and that to me is a very Venus in Virgo kind of energy, where it's like we're being too picky and we're not kind of allowing ourselves the kind of social lubrication that we need. But we can actually form structured groups. We can actually form things that are about our commonalities. Saturn in Pisces, how do we form things that are about our commonalities, right? Because Pisces can leak through, which to me means that that you can't totally regulate Pisces energy. It's either gonna sort of conform to a perfect vessel you build, and if somebody builds a too tight vessel, it's going to leak over the top. It's kind of a limitless amount of water. And I think this sort of idea of the side of government, the what's it called? The Saturn part of government is kind of having trouble Saturning, right? Like there are people pushing against it who are unifying Pisces, seeing commonalities, Pisces, and if you get too picky with who you relate to, Venus in Virgo, it'll hold you back from being able to find commonality. So I think it's really important, this sort of idea of like, how can we come together in more of our commonalities than our differences, while still also acknowledging the differences without needing to fracture into two atomized of groups that can't gel together, right? And so both that Saturn in Pisces, which is opposing the Venus in Virgo, are making squares to the thing that I've been talking about, the Mars Jupiter in Gemini. So that's the 10th through the 20th, and during this tension between these things, and a real desire with this to act, but a real inability not to act, to need to go inside of the structure and the limitation that all of this provides, to go within it and take care of the details. So then when we're removed from the square, we know how to move forward, and we've reflected on the details, but it's very fighty. It does feel like infighting. It does feel like people trying to seek a kind of like freedom and direction and new ideas with the Mars Jupiter in Gemini, like trying to seek out good conversation, but the conversation is kind of like blocked. And whenever Mars makes a square to Saturn, whenever Mars and Saturn are making aspect to one another at all, it can often be, and I've heard so many other astrologers agree with this, just be like pushing the gas and the brakes at the same time. And this feeling of stuckness and almost this feeling of, am I ever going to have a certain pleasure in my body again with that Venus in Virgo? Am I ever going to be able to set my own boundaries, or will the boundaries decided from the outside of me be the things that hold me back? Yeah, and with Saturn Mars aspects, there is like pressing the gas and the brakes at the same time. And Jupiter in this configuration wants so badly to expand, so badly to move forward in this good-natured way, but the car is stuck. Perhaps a new car needs to be built. Okay, moving on. I'm probably going to just end this with a bit of celebration, because Venus enters Libra on August 30th. So we get literally the very last day of the month, Venus entering, oh my gosh, one of her home signs, her home air sign of Libra. And she in Libra, it's like, is pleasant. She wants to have lighter communications. She wants to have a lifted kind of relationship with things, and she's able to notice and see aesthetic pleasures, perhaps the pleasures that Venus was taking care of the details of in Virgo, all of the behind the scenes little annoying things that you have to do around Venus matters, around social connections, around, social lubrication kind of things. Like the social sphere did not feel so lubricated this month. Like the social sphere felt actually like a lot of pickiness and revising was happening, but now on the very last day of the month, we've got Venus entering Libra, one of her home signs. And so going forward, she is actually going to want to beautify and to be in these kind of one-on-one also relationships where the conversation is beautiful and pleasant. And like Libra is all about like picking the right words that keep the community pleasant with each other, that keep things copacetic, that keep people towards seeking beauty. Like Libra really seeks beauty, and it's the scales because it's learned from the sign before it, Virgo, how to be discerning in a way that's a little lighter. Like Virgo's getting into the nitty-gritty and the details, and it's doing hard work about it, and it's very, very practical. And every sign learns something from the sign before it. They're kind of evolving and learning more things. So you see at the beginning of the astrological year with the first four signs, you have this like raw experimental this raw discovery of each element, right? You have this raw discovery of each element. So the first four signs of the zodiac do have this quality of being brand new at the element and being fresh and being like a very pure version of that element. And the second two set of things are really returning to those elements with what they've learned. And so you have this sense of Libra being the second air sign, having a mirror of Gemini in that way. Like I was saying, self and other. Who am I against other people? How do I be in conversation? And Libra has calmed the fuck down from Gemini. Like Libra has calmed down from the Gemini bounciness and said, because I've learned from the shining broadness of Leo and the picky practical Virgo now in the previous fire and earth signs, now when I return to air, I can do it in a more even way. It doesn't feel as manic, right? And so Venus is in her domain. She's back to one of her kingdoms here, and she just wants to make things nice for people. And I think some of the air signs, can come across, like sometimes you get the sense, for me as somebody who has a lot of earth and water in my chart, and I mean very dominantly earth and water, especially earth. But a lot of times you get the sense that like, why can't I have a deep enough conversation with Libra people, or that lightness is not appreciated as much, because I think that there are some signs who are like obsessed on diving into how do we make it work, and like what are the practicalities here, or like this grit and determination, and with the water signs it's like depth and deep ideas, like that satisfies. And so a lot of times when those signs are interacting with Libra, it's like Libra is keeping things light, and we can sometimes think, what's the purpose of keeping things so light? Why can't I go deeper? Why can't I be more honest in a certain way? But Venus in Libra has its own style of honesty, where care for others is this, be able to care for someone by having a bit of distance, but also making things easier for them. And so, you get a lot of times people say that like, Libra can be a little bit of a doormat because it wants things to be equal and fair, and like it expresses the scales in that way. But Venus loves doing that. Venus absolutely loves doing that. So at least the last day of the month, we are starting to get that thing. And I think what Libra has learned from Virgo, what Libra has learned from Virgo is that yes, you can be discerning. Yes, you can get into every single nitty-gritty detail of how to make something actually work. But the culmination of that is, how do we make that work beautifully and nicely? Like, how do we make it work beautifully and nicely and get out of the grit of it and say, I've weighed things on my scales, and here is the nicer, more beautiful thing. And so Libra also has that discernment because it has the scales. And I often feel like once Libra people learn that it's not always about balancing the scales. Sometimes it's about being able to weigh and measure one thing against another. That is a very mature expression of Libra. And I think that Venus really teaches us that, this sort of like, well, my taste is towards this and not towards that, and everybody likes this, so I'm going to bring that. It has the, Venus in Libra always has the quality to me of somebody kind of hosting in their home, and they make all of their favorite dishes because they have discerned aesthetically that those are the best foods that there are. But they've also made a couple of popular things that aren't their favorite. Like they'll do both. They'll do both. The one thing, just going back a sec to August 23rd, the sun will enter Virgo. So we're going to get a lot of light, a lot of shining on some of those Virgo themes, on some of those Virgo themes I was mentioning before, and really being able to see, like the sun goes in somewhere and it shines a light, like it redirects our vision and goes, look, Virgo things. Look, Virgo things. Here's what's good about them. Here's the light shining onto the field, giving you a lot of room to separate the wheat from the chaff in the midday because you can see better. I'm gonna do a whole episode about Virgo, I think, as the old sun enters there at the end of this month. And I'll probably do a couple of episodes that are like mini episodes, kind of going into some of this stuff more deeply. I'm probably gonna do episodes on the moons. If you want to know how all of this is affecting your chart, if you've stayed with me for this whole forecast, if you want to know how some of this is affecting your chart, please go to athenaready.com/astrology. You can see my offerings there. If you look in the description of this podcast, you can see, oh boy, you can see some discount codes for different readings that I offer. I offer face-to-face via Zoom. I offer in person if you're in Los Angeles. I have a few appointments available to that, especially if you're a friend or a friend of a friend. A lot of my clientele is made up of friends and friends of friends of friends of friends, and I really love it. I really love it that way. It's so exciting when somebody just discovers me because without friends of friends of friends of friends also, because I'm like, how did you find me? I'm not like a big let me advertise on the internet, make a whole thing for it. It's just not my style. The friends of friends of friends of friends thing is my style, but it is also so amazing when people find me randomly. But if you are a friend or a friend of friend of friend, and you're in Los Angeles, I do have a couple of in-person appointments available for August and September. And otherwise, we can do face-to-face online, or you can, like I said at the beginning of the show, get an astrological analysis in an MP3 form with dense Virgo amount of information that you can listen to over and over. And that is that is actually the most popular thing that I offer because it's less expensive. And a lot of the clients over the years of mine who get the MP3 analysis stay in touch and come back, and like they get one MP3 analysis a year, and it's something they listen to over and over again because it's like about your chart, your transits, answering your questions, and you can kind of go back and listen and slow things down. And with the MP3 podcast, the MP3 reading offer, I really do encourage people to email me and follow up with any clarifying questions, just so that you don't miss out on that interactive part. And it's great for shy people. Okay, that's enough of that. This has been very long. Thank you for sticking with me. AthenaReady.com/astrology. This has been Star Reader. See ya.